So thank you so much for coming to this session. And just first and foremost, FYI, at the end of the session, there's a feedback form. And when you fill out the feedback form, it will send you a copy of the slides. So you'll make sure you'll be able to get that for everyone. So of course, today we're going to be talking about distance learning strategies for an inclusive special education classroom. And one note I want to make at the beginning of the session is we've been doing a lot of research at CDW about special education and trying to figure out, things that we can help districts with and things we can talk about. But one of the big gaps in the research and in what's being published right now is information about special day classes. So I will try to address that as much as possible, but also to just so you know, that is a section that is going to be a little thin just because there isn't a lot out there that's being shared. So if you're in this position where you're doing special day classes at a distance, I'd love to talk with you more just to learn more about what you're doing and what you're finding your best practices are. But hopefully there'll be some information in the session that is applicable whether you're doing RSP or SDC. But I wanted to make sure I made that known at the beginning just because I know that that is also a big topic of discussion in special ed right now. So just a little bit about me. So I'm Ariana Flewelling, and I'm an educational strategist at CDW. So I am the voice of the educator in conversations. So it's my job to work with CDW to help them understand what are the needs of schools and districts and educators. And then when we're in conversations with districts, essentially help translate technology speak to education speak for both audiences. So this is our second session outline for today. Got a lot to get through, but hopefully we'll get it all done. So we're just going to go over first some background information, some virtual IEP guidance, thoughts about technology vetting procedures, recommendations for distance learning scheduling, and then we'll end with designing accessible digital materials and learning opportunities for students. Because ultimately, as we're planning reopening schools for the fall, it's important to make sure we're thinking about the impact that is going to have on all of the communities you serve. So a little bit of background. So just a timeline of kind of how things have happened in regards to distance learning. So I use March 13th as kind of the date when schools close because with the CARES Act funding, that's the date that they say that purchases on or after that date qualify for CARES Act spending. So I kind of use that, even though I know districts close at different times, that's kind of the date that I use for closing. So originally on the 20th, the California Department of Ed released their initial guidance. The U.S. Department of Education released a fact sheet the day after. And there was additional guidance released on April 9th, as well as now, of course, this month in June, we got the industry guidance from the Department of Public Health and then the Reopening Schools Guidebook, which we will reference in this presentation. So of course, as we think about reopening schools, we need to make sure and ensure that our students with disabilities and other special populations are thought about and fully integrated into the decisions that are being made when it comes to reopening schools. Unfortunately, it is common that sometimes things are thought of for the general population and then someone is like, oh wait, what about special ed? So we really want to make sure that special education is at the forefront of the redesign and reopening process. So based on research CDW has been doing across the United States, we've noticed that there is a trend of 5 different models that are being presented for what school could look like in the fall. So the first is, of course, returning to business as usual, where everyone is on campus. However, you're going to need to institute social distancing guidelines. The next is an adjusted calendar, so either starting the school year later because there is a current influx of cases in your area, starting the school district earlier to account for taking additional time off if there is a second wave in your area, things like that, essentially kind of accounting for rolling closures like many districts do with snow days, for example. Then, of course, there is this idea of an on-site and remote option. So having some students on site, whether that be specific grade levels because of an instructional need or specific populations of students because of an access to services need or certain classes. So at the secondary level, this could be students are on campus for lab sciences, but not on campus for history, social sciences, English, other electives and such that could be done at a distance. The adjusted and the flex schedule is kind of a combination of business as usual and on-site and remote. So this would be either having student cohorts where some students come on Monday, Wednesday, some come on Tuesday, Thursday, or some students coming 1 week and then next group of students coming another week, different things like that. And then of course the last option is full remote. So in the reopening guide for California's public schools on page 13, they outline 4 different potential models. 3 of the 4 all fit in with this adjusted/flexible schedule option. So the California Department of Ed proposed the 2-day rotation model, a week rotation model, as well as staggering schedules as well. And in addition to this, they also recommended the looping structure. So this would be where students would stay with the same teacher they had last year for this year, wherever possible in K-8. And that, of course, would fit in any one of these different options. Now, when we think about reopening, the way I'd like to reframe this, regardless of what model you choose, is thinking about universal design for learning. So universal design for learning, based on the neuroscience research, really breaks it down to the what, the how, and the why students are engaging with their learning and how they learn. And furthermore, when we think about the principles of universal design for learning, it's this idea of making sure there's multiple means of representation, there is multiple means of expression, as well as multiple means of engagement. So thinking of these 3 different principles, how might we apply these to the concept of reopening schools? So as we go through the rest of the presentation, I want to continue to call back to these principles about representation, expression, and engagement, because I truly think that we can use these concepts from UDL to help us in our decision-making process to ensure that not only our students are able to come back to our reopened schools in the fall, but that as well as their families and communities. So when we look at the different options that have been proposed, when we start to think about multiple means of representation, thinking about how is this going to be represented to parents and families, regardless of the option you choose. Let's say, for example, you're working in an adjusted or a flex schedule environment. What are the things that visually need to be shown to parents, families, and students to help them to better understand what is going on with the schedule? Does this need to be a calendar that's sent home so that way it's color-coded, so that way families can understand when their student is going to be on campus? Does this mean you're going to have to make, when you do your social distancing markers in hallways, what are you going to do to make sure that those markers not only are visible to all, but also accommodate access for different types of assistive technology, such as wheelchairs and things like that? Continuing with this idea of adjusted and flexible scheduling, how are you going to not only engage your communities to express their concerns or their questions about this, but how are you going to express what you are planning on doing in school? Are you going to have text messages, Facebook Lives? What different things are you going to use? And then, of course, when we're talking about engagement, it's not just enough to have visuals and have different ways those visuals or those communications are expressed, but really making sure, how is this a two-way conversation with our families? So we'll transition now into virtual IEP guidance. Now, one quick disclaimer, this is guidance, this is not official legal advice. Please make sure if you are in need of that, that you reach out to the relevant resources for your district or your school. But just some things to consider. When we start scheduling IEPs virtually or continuing to do them virtually, obviously you want to make sure that you contact the parent or guardian. But when you do this, we want to, of course, think about those multiple means. So how are we engaging with our parents and guardians in multiple ways? Are we texting them? Are we calling them? Are we emailing them? Are we sending them a letter? Different things like that. Also, it's important when you're scheduling items, if possible and if applicable, make sure that there's multiple meeting notices sent in those different platforms and that all of these communications are documented to ensure that everyone is on the same page of what has been communicated, when, and how. And then, of course, when we're actually talking about the documents related to an IEP, if possible, it's a good practice to try and send relevant information to the parent or guardian prior to the meeting. So that way, if they have questions, or that way if there is additional concerns that they need to bring up, they already have information to be able to walk, or to quote unquote walk into the meeting in. And then, of course, again, this idea of making sure you're using the multiple appropriate platforms. So whether that be putting something in the mail, sending something through a secure document sharing service, things like that. And then, of course, throughout when you're scheduling and documenting, it's important to make sure you address any necessary translation needs for the parent or guardian. And of course, when we're thinking about working with our families, of course, it's not just the IEP meeting itself, but it's making sure, do the parents have access to the IEP meeting platform? So if you are using something like Google Meet, for example, do they have either a device at home that they can use for this, or does a device need to be provided? Or does this mean that instead of doing something with video, something needs to be done with audio only? Thinking about these things ahead of time will help with some headaches later on. It's also important, if possible, I would highly recommend to host a dry run prior to the actual IEP meeting. That way you can, even if it's just a quick 10-minute, I want to check in and say hello, let's use the same platform as the IEP, so that way you can make sure that the family has the appropriate app, or that the Wi-Fi is stable, or that they understand how to access it via the link you sent them via email. So just things like that can help make the process go a little bit smoother. Also, at that point, you can recognize if there needs to be any necessary support or training to help families access the virtual IEP. It's not enough just to be able to say, oh, well, we offered it, but they didn't show. Maybe the reason they didn't show is because they couldn't actually access what you wanted them to click on. So it's a good idea to double check that ahead of time. Also, it's important to make sure that you're prepared with what you physically can offer. We know that there are limitations in regards to the services that can be provided while at a distance, so make sure you know what you are capable of. However, it's always important to make sure that there is room for flexibility, just because students and parents have unique needs, and we want to make sure that their virtual IEP still reflects FAPE for that individual. So working with the families, having these conversations is definitely an important part of moving forward with special ed while continuing to be at a distance. So those are some of kind of the more structural and the more logistical type of things. This next section is something that I find really interesting, just because it is a conversation that isn't always had at school districts. And let me make sure I can get my mouse where I need it to be. There we go. So when it comes to technology vetting processes, there we go. One of the things that I want to talk about with you is from the district perspective first. So when we're looking at technology vetting from the district, we want to make sure that the technology that we're using and that we're bringing into our schools and our district actually is going to work with assistive technology. So first and foremost, whenever you are bringing new technology into a campus, whether it be an app, a piece of hardware, online curriculum, is of course, first you want to look at student data privacy. And I'm going to be using Flipgrid as an example, not sponsored by Flipgrid, but just because I want to show you an example from one tool. So in this case, when we look at Flipgrid, they have their terms of use. So that way you can make sure that what they are doing in regards to student data. So that you can actually see here. And they actually even have a Flipgrid teacher tools kit to help with additional parts about privacy. So this is one thing you want to make sure you look at. The next is this idea to integrate with pre-existing systems. So in this case, when we look at Flipgrid, they have a page about the ways they interact with Chrome, other apps on the internet, Microsoft Teams, Canvas, things like that. So if you're a school district that is using, Google Classroom, then great, there's a Google Chrome extension, fantastic. Because if it can easily integrate with systems you're already using, especially things like Chrome or Teams that already have their own accessibility tools built in, that's only going to help advance the use of this other tool. Then we also want to make sure we pay attention to the availability and usability, not just availability, not just that it's there across platforms. So in this case, when we consider Flipgrid, not only can students access Flipgrid via the browser, there we go, but you can access it via multiple browsers as well as an app on both iOS and Android devices. As an Android phone user, there's nothing I hate more than when I see an advertisement for a cool app and then it's only available on an iPhone. So imagine that you're having that issue in the classroom. You want to make sure that all of your students, regardless of device, are able to access the tool. And then the next section about this is the idea for flexible navigation options that can be accessed with a variety of input methods. So again, when we look at Flipgrid, they have an accessibility statement. And in it, it actually outlines, there we go, the different ways Flipgrid you can use the accessibility features in Flipgrid and the different features it works with. So let's see. Notice there's a question in the chat. So which platform do you find to have the most accessibility for student interface and parent interface? It's going to depend. Are you talking about organizing lesson content? Are you talking about communication? If you could, Jenny, help give me a little bit more information about what type of platform you're looking for or what you're looking to use the platform for, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think like
let's see.
I think what you shared with Flipgrid was great, right? I mean, I'm saying like the immersive reader, the captions, those to me are very student-facing accessibility options that are great. I'm curious if there's anything else, like larger platforms in terms of like things such as like, do you find the same thing with like Google, right? Like LMS platforms, especially as we're thinking about how do we, as teachers, push out that information to parents? Is it accessible for parents? Teachers, I feel like we can work on training them and making those accessible, but with students and parents, I'm curious about what do you find as the most accessible in that respect?
So when it comes to learning management systems, I personally haven't used one in quite a while. My last district I worked in was a G Suite for Education district. So my main platforms for hosting class as well as hosting lesson content was Google Sites and Google Classroom. I kind of used a combination of the two. Since with Google Classroom specifically, there isn't a parent interface. There's only emails that were sent to parents. So there are, so I use those two tools in tandem. And because of the way Google Sites and Google Classroom are designed, they do meet with different accessibility standards. Also too, when students are using it on the Chromebook, there are additional accessibility tools built into the Chromebook. So that made it easy for my students to interact with those platforms. When it comes to, and collaboration platforms. So that's the crazy thing about all of this is every tool looks at accessibility a different way. And some tools integrate with Microsoft Immersive Reader, some tools don't. Some tools have accessibility statements like Flipgrid does, some tools don't, which is why I bring this up from a district perspective, because this is one of those things that is difficult to do on a teacher by teacher basis. So I know many districts have put forth efforts to make sure that teachers and students are only allowed to use apps that they approve. So thinking about these different type of accessibility considerations, I would add those on to your checklist of when you're reviewing apps to see not only how do they integrate with your student data privacy, but how do they integrate with these concepts as well. So when it comes to the different platforms, it's hard to say. But I do know that the ones that you mentioned, Seesaw, Nearpod, and Pear Deck, they do have a very active community and customer service base. So this is one of those things where I'd reach out to them directly. Also too, I had my email on the second slide and you'll get it after the presentation. Feel free to email me because I have some more resources that I wasn't able to add into the presentation and be more than happy to share those with you as well. So I know it's not like a definitive answer but definitely please continue to reach out. And also too, when it comes to these items to consider, I don't know if any of you experienced this, but I remember over the summer, one year, our district website seemingly changed overnight because there was issues with the accessibility of the website. And even though it was redesigned to quote unquote be accessible, that still did not mean it was usable. You would click on things and it would go to broken links, go to pages that no longer existed. It was a little bit of a hot mess in a handbasket. So even, while these items to consider, I'm thinking I mostly approach them from the concept of apps and programs and services. It's also important to think about them from just the content that you as a district or as a department or as a school are presenting. So let me get this back up and running properly again. There we go. And then of course, the other point about this is, when it comes to teachers doing this work in their classrooms, so often teachers do their best to make sure that they're designing lessons and content and curriculum that is accessible. But teachers can only do so much based on the tool that they're given. So that's why it's important that as districts and county offices and people that are providing tools, that we work on making sure that accessibility is thought of and built in from the start. And it's also something too, where if you're currently using a tool and you look for accessibility statements and you don't see them, push on that company and ask, where is it? And if they don't have it, tell them they need it, especially if you're paying money for the tool, just because you want to make sure that, oh, and perfect, that's a great resource you put in the chat, Jessica, about the Chrome extensions. But you want to make sure that you're working with companies that understand the needs of your students. And just one other quick note, I didn't mention it before, but these slides that say solutions have links to solutions that CDW works with and can provide. But in this case, these links actually take you to the relevant pages for accessibility for Google, Microsoft, and Adobe. So if you're using any of those tools, definitely click on those links and check those out. So now that we're, continuing to move forward, let's think about the scheduling of class, not just how are we returning to campus. So when we look at these options that we talked about earlier, we want to make sure that when we are scheduling them, we think with special ed in mind first. We think with our English language learners and our other special populations first. And the reason why is we want to make sure that when we are scheduling and when we are picking a reopening scenario, we want to work as hard as we can to actively avoid unintended consequences and creating inequities. So one example I shared in a presentation yesterday is, all right, you're going to do, a version of on-site and remote. So, you'll have students on campus for some things and remote for other things. Great. How are you going to group your students? Oh, well, we're going to create small cohorts, and those small cohorts will only ever see the other kids in their cohort and their teacher. Fantastic. What about your special ed student that is in an SDC class and is mainstreamed for a part of their day, whether that be PE, math, or some other portion of instruction? What happens to that student? Are they included in the SDC cohort? Are they included in the Gen Ed cohort? Can they go in between the two? Who knows? It's hard to say. So then one response to that is, okay, well, how about we have the teacher live stream their lesson to the student that would normally come to class for that. So that way the student remains with their SDC cohort, but can still access the content from when they would normally be mainstreamed. Great, we're moving in the right direction. We're making sure the student still has access to those services that they're entitled to in their IEP. But one thing we need to make sure we still consider is part of mainstreaming a student isn't just access to the content, it's also access to their grade level peers. So how do we work on that as well? So just want to make sure that we consider these different items when we're going through our scheduling. So like I said before, some ideas to consider is, of course, start with your special ed populations in mind. If you're thinking about these students, you're going to be thinking about barriers that quite possibly also affect other students as well. When we consider the different conditions for social distancing, I mentioned it earlier, but it's still worth mentioning again. when you're thinking about the pathways that you're creating for people to get from one part of campus to the other, are they wheelchair compatible? Do they actually, can the width of a wheelchair go through those different one-way walkways? Also, it's important to try as much as humanly possible as a district to have consistency across campuses. So you want to make sure that if one school, the SDC kids that need mainstream curriculum are getting it over a video call, then you want to make sure that that is the case in other campuses as well. Because consistency is not only good for families, but it's also good for documentation purposes. So that way, if someone were to ask, well, you know, what's your policy about this? You can say, as a district, we've made the decision to do X, Y, Z. Instead of somebody saying, I have one kid at elementary school and they're getting their mainstream this way, and my other kid at middle school is getting their mainstream time that way. Why is it different? Now, maybe there might be some sort of structural reason why it could be different from elementary to secondary, but you want to think about that and be prepared to have that answer. Also, when it comes to scheduling, when we think about the way teachers are starting to structure their lessons and their scope and sequences, it's important to alternate between teaching new content as well as reviewing that content to make sure that we are continuing to engage our students and ensure that they're able to access the content. Because when you're in the classroom, of course, you can see when kids are frustrated or putting their head down or going to sleep, things like that. When you're virtual, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's been kids that have set their icon to look like they're paying attention or to look like they're loading. Or of course, kids can look like they're in class, but have their webcam off and have their mic muted. So it's definitely important to make sure you're alternating between those two types of things. As I said earlier, don't forget to make sure you're asking questions to avoid unintended inequities. And then when it comes to synchronous versus asynchronous learning, some of the things that we've seen is if you were a district that was all synchronous all the time or a district that was only asynchronous, what we're finding is many districts looking towards the fall are meeting in the middle. So that way there is a mixture of both, because the synchronous is important for community in thinking that keeping students connected to teachers and their peers, but also the asynchronous is important because not all students are going to be able to watch a session live. Or thinking about our special education students, if you're teaching a new concept live and the student needs additional help in review, the student can go back and watch the video to see you teach the concept again. And of course, when you think about synchronous and asynchronous, it's always important to make sure you focus on access and your community over a preference for a specific model. So, you know, it's very difficult to teach live over video. However, if that's something that is shown that your community needs and your students are reacting to, it's important to do your best to get a little bit beyond your comfort zone to provide that opportunity to students and families. And then one idea that I got was the idea of implementing blank alike meetings. So this exact example came up with a conversation that I had last week. And the idea was, right now there's, in the local CELTA for Santa Cruz, they're having job-alike meetings for RSP, SDC, counselors, all these different things. And as concerns come up from these meetings, they're being shared up the chain of command, so that way there can be consistency in decision-making and messaging, but then those decisions and those actions are also coming back down. So that way, what's happening in those job-alike meetings is not only affecting positive change, but it's being communicated to the people that brought up the concerns. Because sometimes things go up, but they don't always come back down. So we want to make sure that that happens. But the reason why I put blank alike is I didn't want to just put job alike, because also too, when you're doing your scheduling, could you implement family alike meetings? So if you have a subset of families that have multiple children at multiple campuses receiving special education services, could you bring them together on a call to either provide them with support and training or provide them with an opportunity to ask questions? If you have a group of students that all normally receive the same speech services, could you bring them together into a meeting to have them receive services, or even just to continue to meet and have that, that social interaction? So I think these type of alike meetings could be really useful for providing help to parents, help to students, and then of course help to peers as well. So now we're going to get into the concept of designing accessible materials and learning opportunities. So earlier we talked about the different technology things to consider at a district level to make sure that we are implementing accessible technology. However, even if technology is accessible, it is only as good as the way people are creating content within those platforms. So I'm working on this presentation over the weekend, and I'm thinking about accessibility. And I realized, and I thought to myself, I have no idea if my slides are compatible with screen readers. I have no idea if my slides are compatible with different software for visual impairment. And it was a really kind of, it was an eye-opening moment just because I've been presenting for years and I felt quite ashamed that I hadn't thought of that before. Luckily, thank you, internet and Google searching and friends, I was able to reach out to people and they pointed me to some great resources to help address this. But even someone like myself, I was one of those content authors that wasn't properly formatting content. And now, definitely going to be something that I consider all the time. And this is something that is important for districts to impart on teachers, especially in professional development, not just while we're learning at a distance, but while we move forward and eventually come back to all students back in the classroom. I don't know if you saw the kick note from John Carippo this morning, but one of the things he mentioned was teachers looking for tools to make PDFs editable. Well, the problem with a lot of those tools is they take the PDF and then they put an editable interface on top of it, kind of like a layer of lasagna. The problem with doing this, though, is now since students are editing on this top layer, a screen reader doesn't have access to actually read where the instructions are. So while it's a good idea because you want to have students interact with things, now you've actually created a problem for a lot of students that won't be able to fully understand what you're asking them to do. So big example that I wanted to make sure I brought up for everyone. So of course, when we're redesigning lessons, what we talked about UDL a little bit at the beginning of the session, but I also want to make sure I bring it back up now. So when it comes to UDL, CAST, fantastic organization for this, and they post quite a bit on Instagram, which is fantastic. And they had these tips for planning for remote learning. So let's see. Here we go. So again, how are your learners going to engage with the lesson? How is the information presented to the learners? And then how are the learners expected to act strategically and express themselves? So I think these are three great questions for teachers to think about when they're designing their lessons, because it goes back to those principles and those ideas we talked about earlier about representation, engagement, things like that. So these are just a couple of different ideas for that I wanted to make sure I shared. And then of course, other thoughts on universal design for learning is really addressing the barriers to learning prior to teaching. So often we make our lesson, we're super excited, we think it's going to be great, and 10 minutes in, everything goes pear-shaped because a group of students can't access the way we thought we could. So really, it's important to think about those potential barriers at the beginning. And a lot of that goes back to knowing who your kids are and knowing what their strengths are and knowing what their challenges are. Because we always say, you know, when we're talking about questions like, oh, you should always ask the question because if one person asks it, there's probably 5 people that want to ask it but aren't saying it. So when it comes to learning barriers, you may know that one student has a specific barrier, but there may be anywhere, from 1 to who knows how many more in your classroom that have the same barrier. It just hasn't been expressed yet. So if we think about these barriers that might get in the way of students learning prior to teaching, we can plan for them and we can accommodate for them, because the scaffolding that's good for one student will likely help all students. And then of course, when we're thinking about our lesson design with UDL, it's going to be aligned to standards, but we want to make sure that skill mastery is at the center. Because really when it comes to remote learning, where we're seeing the most success is where you have quality of assignment over quantity of assignment. Again, in the kick note, John Carippo talked about how many assignments and how many notifications students were receiving about these assignments. If you think about how many assignments did you do during the day as a teacher prior to COVID-19 versus how many you're doing in an online class, are they the same? Are they different? We found some teachers are doing more for the sake of justification and doing more. But is that really helping all of your students, especially your students with special needs? And yes, Lisa in the chat said that intentionality is key, and I completely agree. And then, of course, when it comes to UDL, really making sure you're teaching students how to learn, so that way it helps them learn your content. And then in the guide for reopening schools from the state of California, it explicitly states that learning goals should be clearly established and explicitly communicated to students. So I know when I was a first-year teacher in the classroom, there was this big movement to write your objective and your Common Core standard on the board, so that way students knew what you were learning that day. And that really didn't do a whole lot, especially when we got to the point where we're just like, oh yeah, it's fine. I'm gonna write this on a piece of paper, laminate it, put some magnets on it, and just throw the magnets up on the board. That didn't really clearly or explicitly communicate to students what the goals were and how the standards and how their work related to the goals. So we wanna make sure that as we're communicating with students, we let them know what is the learning target, what lessons are connected to that target. And then of course, continually giving feedback, checking back in with the goal. Specifically making sure that when we give that feedback, we're focusing on progress towards the goal, not on the deficit. It's very easy to say, well, you did this, 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 and this wrong. And of course, it's important to know what you did wrong because that's how you improve. But we want to make sure that, you know, let's say it's in an English class and the student's writing a thesis. Maybe they forgot a portion of it, but they got the other two parts. Start with, you did a great, these are the places where you succeeded in your thesis. Here is an area for growth. And again, not saying you did it wrong, but saying it's an area for improvement. So that way we make sure that our students are getting the feedback, the positive feedback, but also getting the growth feedback. And then whenever possible, you want to take advantage of software supports that help you communicate things. So whether this is, you know, just putting a heading at the top of an assignment or putting an announcement in your LMS, whatever tool is going to make the most sense to clearly communicate to students, that's where you want to be. And then, of course, some additional items to consider as you are creating content is you want to make sure you think about adjusting the presentation of information. So in this case, this could be things like font size, font style, as well as colors, contrast. Also, if you are using audio or video, it's important to have either closed captions or a transcript. I know when I was in the classroom and I was looking for nonfiction text to supplement what we were reading, I always remember one example was when we were reading There Will Come Soft Rain, and I was looking for information about smart cities and in-home technology. I found a piece from NPR, and I was so excited because since it was NPR, there was the audio and there was a transcript. And that became kind of like my go-to for nonfiction because I knew it would have that audio and a transcript. So that way we could annotate the transcript, but then also students would be able to follow along with that while we did the auditory portion. And then also it's important to clearly structure things and use descriptive headings and links. So when you're editing things, especially, for example, like in slides, when you're editing it, it says title text, and then it says body text or subtitle text. Sometimes people will delete these boxes and start using other text boxes, but the problem is if you delete some of these preset boxes that say, you know, insert title, insert body text, insert subtitle, you're actually taking structure away that screen readers use to help people better understand your document. So we definitely want to keep an eye on that. And also, of course, the standard click here link is not descriptive. If you're going through and there's 5 links in your document and they all say click here, click here, click here, how is the person that's using those tools really going to know what those links are? And then, of course, clarifying expectations with directions and modeling. This is always important, but definitely even more so while we're at a distance. And then, of course, wherever possible, you want to strive for consistency. So if you have a science lab report, every single time you assign that lab report, you should give your students the same template. So then that way, maybe they don't always use every section depending on the lab that they're doing, but the report format is always the same. So that way students know the expectations and they know what they need to complete. So just some closing thoughts before we get into our Q&A is, again, from the guidebook, we're talking about, we want to make sure that the opportunities that we create are robust and are engaging, but have equity built in for all of our students, including those with disabilities, because we know there are facets of education that did not work for our students with disabilities prior to the onset of distance learning. So we want to make sure that as we go back to school, the things that we knew and then the things that we learned while at a distance, we bring them to the forefront to continue to design a better education system for all of our students. So thinking back to our technology and our universal design for learning considerations, of course, your multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement. How can you take those 3 concepts and embed them into your decision-making process to keep special education students not as an afterthought, but as a hand-in-hand thought right along with your general education students? And then when it comes to your technology, how can you make that content easy to find and easy to use? How can you continue to perform accessibility checks on current and future technologies? And then how do you make sure that your content is working on multiple platforms? Because when you think of these 6 things together, you're really going to start creating environments in which all of your students, whether they be special education students or not, are able to more actively participate in their learning and in their school community. So just a quick shout out to some of the folks that helped influence and with this conversation and the different, some of the top 5 things that they said to think about if you remember nothing else about this presentation is really investigate UDL as a way to think about special education in all facets of your system. Do your best. We're all struggling, but do the best that you can with the situation that you're given. To be flexible whenever possible, to make sure that you communicate with families openly, transparently, and consistently. And last but not least, to document the steps that you take to provide services to students. So here is the feedback form. So I will put that link actually in the chat.